I sometimes think when you look down the list of people that Glenn Mulcair was picking fights with, as it were, he was very, very unwise in some of his choices. The News of the World was stirring up a lot of very smart, very articulate, and very resourceful people. And we have 2 or 3 of them in the room, and one of them is about to speak now. Mary Ellen Field, whom you may have come across, who was working as a consultant to Elle Macpherson when the News of the World decided to hack her phone. So welcome to Mary Ellen. She'll tell you some of her story.
I won't bore you with my story because I've tested it too much, because I've testified at medicine and with lots of other things. But I was never a target because, like a lot of the victims, I'm a nobody, but I had the misfortune to have some celebrity clients, and one in particular was hacked, and I was blamed for leaking information. And so I had a very unpleasant time over the last 6 years and 6 months. As you may have noticed, I'm Australian, so I thought I'd take the opportunity to give you a bit of background about how the Murdochs function, because when I was growing up in Australia, we actually learnt about the exploits of Keith Murdoch, his little escapades in the Dardanelles in the First World War. But then, now that all this has happened, I've sort of looked at it more, looked at the Australian government archives, and they do rather tell a different story. So, in the mid-19th century, Lord Palmerston, in answering a question from an MP who asked who were Great Britain's friends, he said, Great Britain has no permanent friends, only interests. And that's a really good description of what the Murdochs do. They don't have any permanent friends. For our silly politicians of all sides to think that he actually liked them or that he wanted to be with them, he didn't. They only do things that are for their own interests. Now, the fascinating things about media groups is that most of them seem to come from families. It's an interesting thing that most of the major media groups are families and they inherit. The fascinating thing with News Corporation, even though it's a public company, the Murdochs own very few shares, but own all the voting rights. So to go back to the beginnings, we've been putting up Murdochs in Australia for 100 years. Currently, News International in Australia owns 71% of the print media. So there's not much space for anybody else. Lachlan Murdoch, Rupert's older son, is chairman, and until recently chief executive of Channel 10, one of our national TV networks. So Rupert's father went off to Gallipoli in 1915, and he did a very courageous thing, and he took a letter from some of the soldiers, their generals, and took it back to England, but he was arrested in Marseille, and they took the letter away from him, and so he got back to England, remembered what was in the letter, his version of it, and wrote it up. And so he then, after getting the English generals changed, decided to have a go at, although he had no military training at all, he told our Prime Minister at the time that he had to get rid of our commanding general, John Monash, who was by everyone was an excellent general. But Rupert Murdoch and one of his friends decided that this General Monash wasn't manly enough to lead Australian soldiers because of his religion. So fortunately our Prime Minister at the time, Billy Hughes, totally ignored them, but he didn't last as Prime Minister for very long after that. Then in 1932, the Australian Broadcasting Commission was founded. So for the next several years, and you can see all of this in the Australian Government Archives, Keith ran a campaign against the ABC, which is something that we remember that's happening in Australia now and here with the BBC. And he objected to the fact that the government had allowed the ABC to have its own news service. Keith's idea of the news service for the ABC was that they could get his papers in the morning, and when the announcer read the news at 6 o'clock each evening in his dinner suit, he would read Keith's version of the news. That went on for several years, a fight over that, and this is also in the government archives, when the chairman of the BBC wrote to the Prime Minister at the time, explaining it was not a good idea to get into bed with Keith. Keith is on record as saying, and that's in the archives as well, I made him, I will break him. So we're not experiencing anything new here. I was fascinated when Rupert said when he was testifying recently that he'd never asked for a Prime Minister for anything. Well, he didn't have to. what I would like to see out of this, just obviously I don't believe we've had, for the last few decades in this country, we haven't had a proper democracy. We've had a democracy where a sort of a democracy where politicians are too frightened to do anything because of what can be done to them. We have the extremes of, in the case of my lawyer being followed by a private detective and his daughter being filmed. I mean, that's what happens in Russia. We have my MP, a single woman, who's now Secretary of State, being followed by the same detective who followed my lawyer. I mean, I don't want to live in a country where that sort of thing is allowed. I am hoping that we won't drop the ball, and lots of friends in Australia say we can't drop the ball. We have to not ever let this happen again. And we have to make sure that our politicians, that we can set our politicians free. I don't want our politicians to be they should always be subject to scrutiny, but I don't want our politicians to feel that they have to kowtow to any media owner again. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Ellen, for actually what was a very polite representation.